September 17th, 2025. A date that will echo through the pages of Burkina Faso news, not as another headline of conflict, but as a declaration of rebirth. In the burning heart of the Sahel, where fear once ruled and hope lay silent, the earth trembled, not from bombs, but from footsteps of freedom. 147 enemies of peace fell. 3 towns, Tawo, Arbinda, Kuroro, breathed again. 15,000 souls stepped out from darkness into daylight, and standing at the center of it all, not in the shadow of any foreign flag, but beneath the sun of his own soil, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, resolute, unbought, unbroken. He reminded the continent that Africa's sons can still defend Africa's home. This is not just war. This is history rewritten by African hands. A story of faith, courage, and the quiet fire that refuses to die. If you believe Africa's story deserves to be told by her own voice, subscribe now and stand with us. Because before the dawn came thunder. And that thunder was called Operation Sahel Thunder. There are moments in history when a nation, long silenced by fear, begins to whisper again, then to speak, then to roar. For the people of northern Burkina Faso, that roar began not in palaces or parliaments, but in the dust of forgotten villages where mothers buried their sons and children learned to pray before they learned to write. For years, the Sahel had been a wound that would not close. Terrorist bands ruled the highways. Farmers fled their fields. Markets stood empty, and every sunrise felt like a question. Will we survive today? Foreign voices offered sympathy and promises, endless conferences, slow funding, and speeches that reached the air, but never the ground. And so the people waited, until one soldier refused to wait any longer. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He was not born into luxury or privilege. He came from the soil he swore to defend. To the youth, he was a brother. To the elders, a reminder of what courage used to look like. And to those who doubted that Africa could ever stand alone, he became a mirror, showing them the truth they had long denied. It began quietly. Intelligence gathered through whispers and worn maps. Reports of extremists meeting in the border towns of Tawo and Arbinda. Satellite eyes confirmed what local eyes already knew. The enemy was digging in. And on the 15th of September, as dawn broke over the dusty plains, the order was given. Move. In that moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Troops advanced, Burkinabe, Malian, and Nigerian brothers in arms, under a single banner, the alliance of Sahel states. No longer beggars of security, but builders of destiny. No longer waiting for foreign aid, but guided by African intelligence, African courage, African purpose. Their mission was clear and sacred: liberate their own people without losing their soul. As gunfire cracked through the morning wind, villagers hid beneath earthen walls, clutching rosaries, Qurans, and the hands of their children. For 8 hours, the town of Tawo became a storm. When the smoke cleared, 23 terrorists lay silent, and hundreds of civilians walked free. Further west, Arbinda, once the beating heart of trade, witnessed its own resurrection. 31 extremists neutralized, 4 camps dismantled, and from the rubble, songs began to rise, low at first, then louder, as if the land itself was exhaling relief. By nightfall, the forces pushed north toward Kuroro, the borderlands where Mali's soil meets Burkina Faso's dust. 15 more insurgents fell there, along with the myth that Africa could not fight for herself. 6 soldiers gave their lives. 18 were wounded, but none turned back. They fought not for applause, not for foreign praise, but for the children who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. When the message reached the capital, it was simple. The towns are ours. The people are free. For the first time in years, the northern wind carried songs instead of screams. Women danced around fires that had not burned for months. Old men raised their hands to the sky and said, "We have seen our sons return." And across the continent, a question began to echo. If Burkina Faso could reclaim her freedom, what else might Africa reclaim? This was no miracle. It was the outcome of faith, discipline, and a refusal to surrender to dependency. And in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was just the beginning, because what began as a mission of rescue had now become a movement of rebirth. Burkina Faso had remembered who she was, but freedom, like fire, must be guarded. And even as the drums of celebration rolled through the Sahel, the young captain looked to the horizon, knowing the next battle was already forming, not in the deserts, but in the headlines. For victory on the ground is one thing, but victory over perception, that is another war entirely. As dawn broke over the liberated towns, the world began to take notice. Some cheered, some doubted, and others, those whose influence once stretched across Africa's sky, felt the first tremor of a truth they could no longer ignore. There are moments when time itself slows, when the dust, the wind, the roar of engines all seem to hold one single question. Will we rise or will we fall? The dawn of September 15th answered that question for the people of Burkina Faso. From Tawo to Arbinda, from Kuroro to the borders of Mali, the earth trembled, not under the boots of invaders, but under the united march of sons returning home. They called it Operation Sahel Thunder, and thunder it was, not the thunder of chaos, but of precision, not the thunder of destruction, but of deliverance. In Tawo, the battle began as the sun climbed from behind the hills. The insurgents had built bunkers deep in the ground, confident that no one would dare come for them. But that morning, courage came walking, carried by men whose hearts burned hotter than any weapon. Shots cracked through the silence. The smell of smoke mixed with red dust. Children hid behind walls of clay, whispering the names of their ancestors. For 8 hours, the sound of war and the sound of prayer became one. And then, quiet. When the dust settled, the streets of Tawo were no longer theirs. Women stepped out of houses that had been locked for months. A boy no older than 10 lifted the Burkina Faso flag and waved it until his small arms shook. An old man knelt, pressing his forehead to the ground. Freedom had returned, and it wore the face of its own people. By afternoon, the operation had moved south to Arbinda, a town once cursed by fear. The extremists had used it as a fortress, a place where justice was silenced and innocence was enslaved. But that day, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's forces encircled the stronghold like a rising tide. From the sky, drones traced the ground. From the ground, warriors moved with the rhythm of purpose. 31 terrorists were neutralized, 4 enemy camps destroyed. Yet even in battle, discipline ruled the hearts of those soldiers. They carried not only rifles, but restraint, not only orders, but honor. Their mission was clear: defeat the enemy, not become him. In Kuroro, near the border where the dust of Mali meets the soil of Burkina Faso, the final act unfolded. 15 more insurgents fell, and with them fell a myth, the myth that Africa could not protect her own. Under the red sky of evening, a message spread through the radios and the hearts of a people. Kuroro is free, Arbinda is free, Tawo is free. And across the land, joy erupted like rain after drought. Women danced with tears in their eyes. Children sang songs they had forgotten. Farmers returned to their fields, reclaiming the rhythm of life that had been stolen from them. In those moments, Africa was not a continent divided by borders. She was one body, one heartbeat, pulsing with pride. Because, for the first time in years, her sons had fought for her without apology. And in doing so, they proved something that could not be measured in numbers or medals. They proved that African security works. The figures were extraordinary: 147 terrorists eliminated, 12 camps dismantled. 15,000 civilians liberated, 50,000 rounds of ammunition seized. Only 6 soldiers lost, 18 wounded. But these were not just statistics. They were the echoes of a continent rediscovering its strength. They were the heartbeat of a new chapter, written not in ink, but in courage. When the soldiers entered the liberated towns, the people did not greet them with fear. They greeted them with food, with songs, with tears. Mothers carried babies on their backs and shouted, "Our sons have come home!" Elders whispered prayers over the soldiers' heads. And a woman named Fatima, her face lined with years of struggle, said softly, "Now we can breathe again." In those words lay the entire purpose of the campaign, not conquest, not revenge, but the restoration of breath, of dignity, of belonging. Yet, as the celebrations rose, the young captain stood apart for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew that every victory births its own trials, because while the guns would fall silent in the Sahel, the noise from beyond, foreign tongues, foreign judgments, was just beginning to rise. The soldiers saw him there, standing quiet in the twilight, and one of them said, "Captain, it's over." Traore smiled faintly. "No, my brother, it's only begun." For though the war in the dust was won, another war, of words, of narratives, of power, was about to begin. And this time, the battlefield would not be the Sahel. It would be the world. The guns had fallen silent, but another war was just beginning, one fought not with bullets, but with headlines, microphones, and calculated disbelief. In the days that followed Operation Sahel Thunder, the victory of Burkina Faso and her Sahel brothers traveled swiftly across Africa. In Ouagadougou, celebrations filled the streets. In Bamako and Niamey, people spoke of a new dawn. But in the corridors of Western media, the tone was different. Doubt replaced joy. Questions replaced congratulations. And truth, once again, stood trial before the court of convenience. Unverified reports, they said, exaggerated numbers. Russian influence. The same phrases that have shadowed African achievement for generations were spoken again, this time against a nation that had dared to defend itself. It was strange, almost poetic. For years, the West had called Africa unstable, helpless, dependent. And yet, when Africans stood tall and proved their capacity, the narrative shifted to suspicion. Victory, it seemed, was acceptable only when it came with Western permission. But the people of Burkina Faso did not need permission to celebrate their freedom. They had lived the pain, they had buried the dead, and now they would define their own truth. Women in Arbinda said, "We saw it with our eyes." Farmers in Tawo said, "We heard the silence after the battle, the silence of peace." Children in Kuroro said, "We can go to school again." That was all the verification they needed. And in the middle of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, neither defensive nor boastful, but resolute. He knew the struggle for Africa's image was older than the struggle for her land. He had watched how stories were twisted, how victories became footnotes, how liberation was often rewritten as rebellion. So he chose his words carefully, not to impress the world, but to remind Africa of herself. "We are not fighting for recognition," he said. "We are fighting for restoration, of dignity, of destiny, of truth." His words spread across the continent like wind through dry grass. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Lagos to Lusaka, Africans heard something different in his voice, an authority not borrowed, but born. And for many who had grown weary of imported salvation, his tone was like a sermon long overdue. But not everyone rejoiced. In Washington, they held meetings. In Paris, they issued statements of concern. Analysts debated whether this African success would shift alliances or embolden anti-Western sentiment. They spoke as if African sovereignty were a threat rather than a right, And once again, the same tired question echoed through think tanks and studios. Can Africa really sustain this independence? To which the people answered, not in essays, not in press conferences, but in action. Markets reopened, schools resumed. Humanitarian aid reached liberated areas within 24 hours, organized by local hands, not foreign missions. The air, once thick with fear, now smelled of food and firewood and laughter. Across the Sahel, a quiet pride began to grow. Not the pride that shouts, but the pride that builds. Not the pride that divides, but the pride that heals. This was not just a military victory, it was a psychological revolution. For too long, Africa's narrative had been written by those who did not live her story. Now, the pen had returned to her hand. And as she began to write again, the ink was not propaganda, it was proof. The proof was in the liberated towns, in the reopened schools, in the children playing football on roads once haunted by militias. The proof was in the widows who could sleep again, in the traders who could sell again, in the songs that returned to the night air. The proof was in the unity of three nations that had once been told they were too poor, too weak, too divided to stand together. Yes, critics could deny the numbers, but they could not deny the sound of joy returning to the Sahel. They could not deny the sight of people walking freely through their own markets. They could not deny the rhythm of hope that began to rise from the red soil. And so the battle of narratives continued, between those who doubted and those who had lived, between those who feared a free Africa and those who were ready to build her, between old voices of control and new voices of conviction. In that struggle, a new truth was being born, not shouted, not imposed, but lived. Because in the end, no headline, no analyst, no politician can erase what the people themselves have seen. The liberation of Tawo, Arbinda, and Kuroro was not just a chapter in a report. It was a chapter in the rebirth of a continent. And as the world argued about numbers and influence, something even greater began to stir: the quiet reconstruction of a land and the louder awakening of a people. For the storm had passed, but the rebuilding had just begun. When the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, a new sound began to rise over the Sahel. Not the sound of war, but the sound of life returning. In Tawo, the Yao market reopened. Women laid out fruit, grain, and hope on wooden tables worn by years of struggle. In Arbinda, a teacher swept dust from the floor of a schoolroom, her hands trembling as she placed the first book on a desk. In Kuroro, children ran barefoot through streets that only weeks before had been ruled by fear. Their laughter was the truest measure of victory. The battle had ended, but the healing had begun. Homes were rebuilt, not by foreign contractors, but by neighbors. Crops were planted not with despair, but with prayer. The same soil that had drunk blood now drank rain. And from that soil, faith began to bloom again. Medical teams, trained and led by locals, brought medicine and care to the wounded. Young men who once carried rifles now carried bricks. Women who once wept for their lost sons now taught the children of others to write their names. And in every act of rebuilding, there was a quiet declaration: we can stand, we can heal, we can build. Across the region, Mali and Niger sent aid convoys, not as donors, but as brothers. The alliance that had fought together was now rebuilding together. And for the first time in decades, the Sahel felt not like a line of division on a map, but like a living body, beating, breathing, whole. Even in the capital, the headlines of Burkina Faso news carried a different tone. Not tragedy, not dependency, but renewal. The world saw pictures of smiling faces where once there were only reports of despair. And quietly, something shifted in the collective heart of the continent. If Burkina Faso could rise, then perhaps others could too. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked through the liberated towns, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of his people. He stopped to speak with elders, to bless children, to listen more than he spoke. And wherever he went, people called him not president, not general, but our son. For in their eyes, he was more than a leader. He was proof that leadership could be love in action. The spirit of the Sahel had not only survived, it had been reborn. The desert winds carried whispers of unity, of courage, of something deeper than politics or power. It was a spiritual stirring, a reminder that Africa's greatest strength had never been her armies, but her resilience. And as the sun set over the plains, one could almost feel it, the heartbeat of a continent, stronger than before, ready to rise again. But even rebirth needs protection, and as the Sahel healed her wounds, the question lingered in every soul. Can this awakening endure in a world that still doubts her light? Every victory carries a question. What now? For Burkina Faso, and for Africa, that question was both a burden and a blessing. The guns had quieted, the fields were green again, but the road ahead stretched long and uncertain. Because liberation is not a destination, it is a discipline. It demands more than courage on the battlefield. It requires courage in the council, hall, in the schoolroom, in the heart of every citizen who dares to believe that freedom must be defended daily. And so began the next chapter. The alliance of Sahel states, once forged in the fire of war, now turned its attention to peace. Intelligence networks remained active, borders were secured, and villages once lost to terror became centers of trade once more. But beyond security, a deeper vision took shape, an Africa that no longer measures herself by foreign approval, but by her people's prosperity. It was no longer enough to survive. The goal now was to thrive. Under the guidance of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the government introduced programs that turned soldiers into builders and battlefields into farmlands. Training academies opened to teach young Africans not only how to fight wars, but how to prevent them, with knowledge, with opportunity, with dignity. Schools, clinics, and markets became symbols of a new defense strategy: education, health, and unity. Elsewhere, the world continued to watch. Some in Western capitals whispered that this model could not last, that self-reliance would falter under pressure. But each morning, in each rebuilt village, the people themselves answered those doubts, not with words, but with work. They rebuilt homes, reopened classrooms, and sowed seeds where others saw ashes. And in doing so, they quietly declared, "We are the proof." In the columns of Burkina Faso news, analysts spoke of a Sahelian renaissance. But in the fields and streets, it was not renaissance they felt, it was responsibility. Responsibility to protect what had been won, to honor the lives lost, to ensure that the light lit in September would not fade with the seasons. Mali and Niger began to mirror Burkina Faso's example, adopting joint patrols and cooperative projects. The idea of African-led security transformed from slogan to structure, and for the first time in decades, conversations across the continent shifted, from what was lost to what could be built. Yes, challenges remained: economic, political, external. But something deeper had changed. The people had tasted self-determination, and they would not unlearn it. This was not the end of struggle, it was the end of submission. And as the winds carried news of rebuilding, a single truth began to take root across the continent. If Africa can defend herself, then Africa can define herself. But even as hope spread, so did the shadows of pressure. New alliances, new expectations, new eyes watching from afar. Would this newfound independence blossom into a continental movement? Or would the weight of the world test its strength once more? Only time and the will of her people would tell. My brothers, my sisters, when the dust of battle fades and the headlines move on, what remains is the soul of a people. And in the soul of Burkina Faso, a new song is being written, a song of resilience, dignity, and hope. For years, Africa was told that her story could only be written from afar, that her victories needed validation, that her freedom required permission. But this September changed that narrative forever. What the world saw in Burkina Faso news was not merely a military operation, it was a moral awakening. The day the Sahel rose was the day Africa remembered who she truly was, not a land of despair, but of destiny. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands as a symbol of that awakening. He is not a perfect man, but a purposeful one. He leads not with arrogance, but with assurance. And through his hands, a generation has learned that the path to sovereignty begins with service. But let this be clear, this victory does not belong to one man. It belongs to a people, to the mothers who prayed through the nights, to the farmers who refused to abandon their soil, to the young soldiers who believed that freedom was worth the risk. It belongs to Africa itself, rising not from aid, but from her own endurance. So tonight, as we reflect, let us carry this truth within us. Captain Ibrahim Traoré may have led the march, but it is the heartbeat of millions that moved the earth. And that heartbeat is yours too. Because when Africa stands, the world must listen. When Africa believes, the world must reckon. And when Africa builds, together, the world will never again call her weak. If this story touched your soul, don't just watch. Speak. Write in the comments, Africa rises. Share this message so others may believe again. And above all, subscribe, not to a channel, but to a vision. The vision of an Africa that walks tall under her own sun. The news may fade, but the truth remains. Burkina Faso has reminded us all that courage, once awakened, cannot be silenced. And that, my friends, is not the end. That is the beginning.